Okay, a warm welcome to this history session offered by De Montfort University's Cultural Exchanges Festival. Thank you for signing up. I'm told that the festival is now in its 20th year. For obvious reasons, this year the festival is entirely online, and in this regard, our thanks go to those who have worked behind the scenes to make our session happen. So special thanks to Beth Chilvers, Gemma Kibble, and also to Mark for his technical support. The topic for this evening's conversation is histories of information and surveillance. And without delay, let me introduce the participants. Firstly, I'm Alistair Black, Professor Emeritus in the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois in the United States. But don't let that location fool you. I'm actually speaking to you from the United Kingdom, and I'll be hosting tonight's event. Also in the UK, we have Dr. Toni Weller, the first of our two conversationalists, if I can use that term. Toni is a visiting research fellow in history at De Montfort University. For nearly 2 decades now, her research has focused on the field of information history, with an emphasis on society and culture in 19th century Britain. She has published and lectured on the history of surveillance, as well as on the impact of history in the digital age. Her book, History in the Digital Age, in fact, being a set text for several courses in Europe and the United States. Toni is a former editor of the journal Library and Information History, and she is featured on the Channel 4 series, Britain's Most Historic Towns, where in one episode, she discussed Victorian etiquette and information culture with the TV historian and archaeologist Alice Roberts over afternoon tea, if I remember correctly. Toni has just finished working on a piece for a collection of essays on the subject of race and surveillance for Cambridge University Press. And joining us from Denmark, we have Dr. Laura Skuvik, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Copenhagen. Her research field is information history in early modern Denmark in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The focus of her research and her publications is information cultures and networks and their implications for surveillance and communication in late absolutist Denmark. Together with Andreas Marklund of Enigma, which is the Danish Museum of Postal and Telecommunications, she has co-edited a book entitled Histories of Surveillance from Antiquity to the Digital Era, subtitled The Eyes and Ears of Power. And that's going to be published by Routledge in June. So may I say it's good to be reunited with both Toni and Laura in a joint exercise. Again, our first collaboration was for Toni's 2011 edited book, Information History in the Modern World. Now, the way things are going to happen this evening is that I will be asking some fairly broad questions to get the conversation rolling and to hopefully keep it moving along in a fruitful fashion. Then later, I'll pitch some questions from the audience. Because of the necessary technical arrangements, these questions had to be submitted and selected ahead of the session. And I apologize to those whose questions have not been selected. Naturally, there are time constraints. Also, because this is primarily a history session, we needed to concentrate on the past rather than issues of information and surveillance in the present. although linking past and present is of course important, and I'm sure that might well arise during the course of tonight's conversation. So let me pitch the first question. I guess that when one speaks of information history, or indeed information histories in the plural, a question which is immediately prompted is, what do we mean by the word information? So Toni, can I turn to you first to address that question, if you could?
Yes, absolutely. It's a really interesting question because it's a really interesting question that emerged really with the advent of this field back in the sort of mid-1990s, and where it emerged out of library information science. There is this very sort of defined need to explore what information was as a very absolute concept. But what we find is that how we think of information varies depending on which field we're talking about. So if you're a mathematician or a computer scientist, you do tend to define information in very precise mathematical terms, whereas a philosopher or a historian in our case doesn't find this so useful, because information as a concept isn't constant over time. Its semantic identity doesn't remain constant over or across space and time. So what we actually mean as historians when we talk about information is actually tracking the attitudes and values that help us understand this idea of information in the past. Essentially, we as historians use a good historical methodology to use information as a tool of kind of historical inquiry, as a heuristic tool to explore what might be considered some of these modern themes, such as dissemination of information, access, preservation, surveillance, obviously, which we're going to talk a lot about tonight, and try and explore those as anchors into the past to see how past peoples and societies understood these modern, what we think of modern concepts.
Okay, thank you. Laura, have you got anything to add to that?
I've got some issues with the net here in Copenhagen. It's apparently not working that well, but I hope you can hear me. I guess I know what Toni said, actually. And one of the troubles that you meet, particularly in a Danish context, when you study the history of information, is that the word didn't exist until at least the beginning of the 20th century. So it wasn't in that use that we normally, or that we find in more broadly speaking American English wording and so on. So that is one of the issues that I deal very much with, is that it was used as instruction, education, and not the way that we use it today. But that is also what is fascinating about the histories of information.
Yeah, and that's actually a really interesting point, because the sort of etymological origins of the word go back to the sort of medieval Latin and Old French, meaning kind of formation of the mind. And indeed, even in the 19th century, the idea of news and education and information were all used quite interchangeably. So as historians, when we look back to the past, we have to be quite careful not to put our modern assumptions onto the understanding and the semantics of words that were being used then in past societies.
Yes. And if I can just throw something in there, I quite like Jeffrey Nunberg's idea about information, which is, he speaks about the corpuscular nature of knowledge equating to information. So you can think of information snippets of knowledge. And I think generally that's how in our modern age people tend to think of information. But of course, that's only today. And as was said, we need to see how previous eras defined it. So can I move on from information to information history and ask what might we mean by the term information history? And I guess what I'm getting at here is, would you agree that there are many histories in the plural of information?
Yeah, absolutely. Laura, do you want to talk? Or
Go ahead, Toni, and then I'll jump in.
Okay. Yeah, I think absolutely there are plural, multiple histories of information, without any doubt. And what's interesting is that although information has existed in some understanding in human society since antiquity, the actual historical study of information, its historiography, is relatively recent. That's only really emerged from the sort of the 1990s, late 1990s. In fact, Alistair was one of the earliest advocates of the field. So by that I mean scholars, historians, specifically looking at information as an explicit concept in its own right, as a tool of inquiry. So in the early 1990s, that's very much informed by the rise of the personal computer and the internet. We see a lot of histories of, therefore, the kind of the computer state and the role of the computer in society. But as we've moved through since then, in the previous decades, that's been expanded by other modern concerns, the culture of information, the surveillance state, personal privacy, and all of these kind of ideas. I think, would you agree with that, Laura?
I definitely do agree with that. And what is particularly interesting is, I think, how the history of information, or the histories of information, has sort of been hijacked in a way by a technological aspect, or the technological and computer aspects that you just briefly mentioned, Toni, sort of making or issuing a birth certificate for information in 1948, as the American philosopher Colin Koopman suggests in a recent publication about this. And that sort of makes it even more also intriguing, but also even more difficult actually to focus on cultural aspects or social aspects of information and the histories of information. Or what would you agree on that, Toni? Or what do you?
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely think that the tendency to focus on information technology when we say information can be quite distracting from these broader histories in plural, because of course the way in which information is being collected, these processes of use, dissemination, access, preservation through the past centuries have very direct social and cultural implications. And we can see that in the way that people interact with one another. And I think we'll talk as the conversation progresses about some of the ways in which that happens. But also in terms of cultural artifacts, films, books, discussions, the way that information was shared and disseminated through these kind of cultural mediums as well. It's easy to get distracted by digital and technology because these are so contemporary. But there's lots of other ways that we can explore these themes as well.
Yeah, just to bring an end to this particular question, just as there are many histories of information, I think there are many different academies that produce information history, and therefore it's difficult for people to, as it were, to sign up to an academy called information history. You get people from business, management, geography, literature, that they're doing what one could, what I would certainly call information history, but they wouldn't necessarily see themselves through that identity. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
May I jump in here? I think that is actually a great point that you made there, Alistair. And I also think that that you see people getting excited about, for instance, doing media history. So suddenly they get at this. How does that affect, for instance, information, or how does that relate to information? But they find themselves within media history or within communication history, but sort of having information as a common denominator or identifier. I don't know. But we also see, I think, then these multiple histories of information defined by, for instance, also how historians use information for their historical research, but they would not sort of define it as information, but as sources. So, so discussing histories of information is something that also what would you say, spawns multiple disciplines within the academic field, and that of course also makes it interesting, but also sometimes difficult to grasp in a way.
Okay, thank you. Well, moving along, Toni there just alluded to the importance of something like the preservation of information. So what do you think the significance is of the theme of the preservation, or indeed the destruction of information historically?
Oh, this is such a huge topic. But yeah, absolutely. I think that definitely falls within the remit of information history, and it's the idea of preserving information is an old one. And in the 19th century, for example, there were a lot of publications that were started. Penny magazine, for example, in the 1820s, established for the working class a cheap publication periodical every month, which was designed to give them access to what was called useful knowledge, set up by the SDUK, the Society for the Diffusion of Knowledge, set up specifically to give useful information to the working classes. And what we see a lot of evidence for is working people from that time collecting these periodicals, taking great pride in the fact that they are preserving this knowledge, this information, building up a kind of encyclopedic reference. So we see very clear examples of this sort of thing, but also, of course, we can look at things like if we jump forward to sort of the post-war period in the Stasi in Eastern Europe, the collection of information of 45 million plus pages of information collected by the informants from that time, which again was preserved in the central repository. And then when we start talking about the destruction of these type of pieces, the ways in which governments, societies, individuals protect this knowledge, this information they've collected. With the Stasi, for example, when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989 and the forces come in to sort of liberate, those files, these 45 million pages, were put through shredders, torn up, and is still trying to be resurrected today to preserve that sort of history. It's quite transient in many ways, but as historians, we're always trying to track that record. Richard Overton's done a great book recently on the deliberate destruction of knowledge through history and the role of libraries, particularly in preserving that information.
Okay, Laura, over to you.
Thank you. I was just thinking about also a genuine practice within archives is sometimes to get rid of old stuff that is deemed not interesting for coming generations of historians, and we are sitting weeping today about how things were sorted out and thrown out from the National Archive in Denmark at the beginning of the 19th century. But that is a general feature that is not necessarily combined also with the sort of powerful instances of information that Toni just talked about. I mean, the shredding of the Stasi files shows that information is also deemed dangerous in some cases.
Yeah, and I think it can link quite interestingly as well from a historical point of view when we talk about information now in the kind of digital age. As historians, the sources that historians for the future will be using are now all digital and transitory. So we have this tension between the kind of the ease with which things can be deleted. Things aren't recorded in the same way on paper as they used to be. So for a historian of the future, that's quite difficult to manage, and archivists, librarians are doing an amazing job trying to preserve some of that. And yet at the same time, this this sort of tension between the fact that we as individuals living now have this sort of digital footprint that follows us potentially through our lifetimes. So it's an interesting view, and compared to how things have happened historically in the past for historians, looking at information as sources and the way in which it's used and preserved and destroyed, and what's happening now, I think. Oh.
So I can perhaps just add here too that one of the interesting cases in the Renaissance was the fear, the great loss of all the paper rolls from antiquity that had been experienced during the Middle Ages, and suddenly this experience sort of provoked a kind of information lust for keeping and preserving, and also finding new ways of managing, as Toni just said, encyclopedic. In an encyclopedic way, preserving knowledge and information in order to prevent the same loss again.
Thanks, Laura. Sorry, earlier I was talking, but I hadn't unmuted myself. So, moving on for that, we've if information has made it into the present day, it's not been destroyed. That doesn't mean to say that that information in the past is, as it were, pure. So one could conceptualize the notion of fake information in the past, that there's been misinformation activity in the past. How would you respond to that?
Should I begin, Toni?
Yeah, please.
I think we've got ample examples, and one of the most frequent that we sort of also see as that circulates today is the propaganda machine that was developed during the 1930s Nazi regime in Germany, and that of course is also showing how difficult it is to determine or to define or to talk about fake news. Is fake news the same as propaganda, for instance? Is fake news the same as misinformation? But at least we see cases, and the historian Heidi Tvorek has, for instance, followed how German news agencies, specific German news agencies, the Telegraph Union, deliberately produced fake news about an assassination of a Soviet minister of the interior in the 1920s. So that's just one example, and I think we can find many others examples. We can also discuss the case of rumors that is sort of evolving, and discuss whether rumors and fake news like fictions are sort of doing the same in unstable and nervy times as we experience right now, for instance, sort of making a way of comprehending difficult situations around us.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and certainly, you know, if we look at sort of things like Orwell's 1984, when he talks about the Ministry of Truth, there's a lot of ideas there playing with the idea of what is truth and how is that presented, and at what point does it become an untruth, which I think reflects many conversations perhaps that are going on at a bigger kind of level today. But it's interesting. It was interesting to me when you were talking about this idea of rumour and how that can perpetuate untruths or mistruths. And I think that we can see there's evidence for that, certainly in the 19th century, with the rise of the kind of popular print culture and a sort of visual culture that was going on at the time as well. There's an example from 1844 of the post office scandal, in which the then Home Secretary was caught in the act, essentially, of opening private mail in the sort of the national interest with the defence. And the government, this is something that's been going on for many years, back to sort of Cromwell's time in the Civil War. But this was the first time the government were kind of caught in the act, as it were. And what was interesting was that because the government chose not to make a statement, not to make a response to this, it was kind of picked up and played with, and the public opinion, the sensational, the stories at the time in the press and so on, created all sorts of other ideas about what was behind it, what had really happened, and made it much more of an event because of this rumour that kind of made it much bigger, to the point that it was even reported in the press in Australia and New York. So I think, yeah, that feeds really interestingly into your idea of rumour and speculation can assist this idea of misinformation.
Yes, and in fact, that's good, Toni, because in fact we had a question on that from Isabella Blount about the postal espionage crisis of 1844. So hopefully what you said has answered that question. Anything to add, Laura, before we move on?
I think I can talk about this for ages, but just to add one tiny bit, I mean, rumors are, I think, a natural component. We do that almost also on an everyday basis without having bad intentions. But rumors are also very dangerous for governments, for systems of rules. And so the Danish king at the beginning of the 19th century was really worried about rumors in a situation where the country was at war, and the communication lines were really bad and poor. So he sort of had to navigate in preventing people from obtaining rumors, but at the same time he wanted to get rumors because they could also be important in order to navigate in the war. So that is sort of signaling how different and difficult it is to navigate in these muddy waters of black markets of information, I think a Danish historian has called it.
Yes, and of course, you're using the word rumor there, and immediately the word rumor comes up. One thinks of gossip as well, and I've noted that there's quite an interesting strain of work in the history of gossip within history recently. Okay, can I change gear now and move on to our second theme, that of surveillance? And I guess I wanted to ask, what do we actually mean by surveillance? And if I could ask you, Laura, to kick off with this one. You're the co-editor of the new book, which I mentioned at the start of the session, and to which Toni has contributed. What were the main themes of the book? That might be a way into answering that question.
I think one of the issues that we wanted to focus on in that book was, or with that book and with the conference that led to the book, was actually trying to also provide, or to sort of get historical sense and historic knowledge in current debates about surveillance. That was the main issue also for doing the book. And then talking about surveillance today and how it's unfolding today is one thing, but also to look at how actors of surveillance, what kind of actors have been doing surveillance in in our great long history of whatever, whenever, because surveillance has a very long history and it's not reduced to contemporary surveillance of big data and tech companies and so on. So looking at actors and looking at what kind of phenomena that have been under surveillance, for instance, surveillance of information, surveillance of population, surveillance of minorities, surveillance of sexual conduct and behavior and so on. So what kind of phenomenon? That was sort of what we wanted to explore with this book, and the book shows how many histories of surveillance that we can find, and not just one history of surveillance.
Yeah, absolutely, and it was a really exciting project to be part of. And the chapter that I contributed was talking about, as Lauren's just sort of noted, really, that surveillance is quite a unique phenomena in that it's a profoundly kind of ancient experience, human experience, and yet at the same time it feels extremely modern. You know, it's very, very relevant and contemporary. You know, there are examples of surveillance back in antiquity, and in fact, when we think of human and sort of religion, actually, the idea of God, whoever your God or gods is or are, being the eye in the sky and observing behavior, and observing, you know, human behavior really from the word go. There's that idea, I think, is very powerful. And David Leon has written some really interesting stuff which talks about the secularization of surveillance as we sort of progress through human development, human history, if you like. So there's that idea, I think, is very interesting. And also, as Laura also alluded to, the fact that we as individuals aren't just sort of passive subjects of surveillance. We, in all sorts of ways, are active consumers of it, participants in surveillance. So that idea, I think, is a really important one as well to discuss and draw out in the book.
And if I can just perhaps follow up, because exactly what this book shows is that even though we find the state as a sort of continuing actor within surveillance, the state relied on people in villages, in households, in all sorts of functions in society, who sort of acted as spies or agents or denouncing not acceptable behavior or whatever. So the state is not just this abstract phenomenon doing surveillance, but relied on people actually performing surveillance, you could say.
Yeah, and there's lots of examples of that. I mean, there's obvious ones from the post-war period that we've sort of touched on already, but there's an interesting one from the 19th century as well, involving what was called the Contagious Diseases Acts from the 1860s, in which, in order to try and contain the spread of venereal disease, which was seen as affecting the army and therefore the strength of the nation, these acts were legislated for to try and curb that through the spread of preventing basically the spread through prostitution with soldiers and army barracks. But the way in which it was enforced was basically on speculation. So if you were a woman who was suspected of having this disease or suspected of having passed it on to anyone, you could be put on a register, you could be detained for quite a long period of time and have quite unpleasant intimate examinations taken place upon your physical body. So these ideas were spread. It's very unpopular, and police could come to a woman's home if they suspected her. So this idea again of people informing on others or observing police coming to a private home also kind of blurs the boundaries a little bit of private and public information, personal information, and surveillance.
So if I could just bring in the word that often comes along immediately after one mentions the word surveillance, and that is the idea of panopticism. I'm aware that our audience today isn't an academic audience. It's what you might call a citizen audience. So I wonder if one of you or both of you would like to say something about panopticism.
Should I begin, Toni?
Please do.
So the panopticism is, or relies on, or is connected with the French philosopher Michel Foucault, who in the 1970s sort of devised this panopticism based on Jeremy Bentham's design of a panoptic prison, where you had a tower in the middle, and then you had the cells sort of gathered around this tower. For those of you who are not perhaps who knows this prison, Google it and you'll find amazing pictures of it. And the idea was that in this tower, an inspector would be present and could be present at all times, but was unseen by the inmates who were sitting in the cells around this tower. So the inmates would not know when they were under actual surveillance. And the general idea of Bentham was that then these inmates would then behave accordingly at all time and sort of internalize the norms of good behavior and being good and productive citizens afterwards. And this idea sort of Michel Foucault took and furthered it into a more general concept of surveillance in modern society that he sort of defined as a disciplinary society, where this all present kind of surveillance linked to the gaze in manufacturers, in schools, in public libraries. I've done my own research about that too, was sort of internalizing the norms of society and the norms of the modern society in order to make good, productive subjects or citizens. So that is a general idea of the panopticon, and it's closely linked to surveillance, kind of also is a later criticism, a very physical surveillance based on actually gaze and architecture. Yeah, do stop me, Toni. Otherwise, I talk about Foucault and Panopticon the rest of the evening.
I was going to make the point you mentioned there about libraries and Panopticon, and there's quite an interesting body of work there that both Alistair and yourself have contributed to, about the idea that, particularly again in the 19th century with workers and the rise of the public library, the kind of uneducated classes, if you like, who couldn't be trusted with certain ideas in case they became too radical. There was some sort of panopticon watching of what was read in the library and what was how that was sort of managed almost. And it's interesting how much the idea of the panopticon has filtered into our modern lives without us even realizing it, to the extent that if any of the audience have children of a certain age, they may be familiar with a program called Lego Ninjago, and in it there's a prison called the Cryptarian Prison, in which the villains are housed, and it is an exact replica of Bentham's 18th century panopticon. So unless you're looking out for it, you wouldn't notice it or see it, but it's interesting to me that it's there embedded in this sort of animated 21st century cartoon for children, and yet the idea is one that is related to something much more associated with these ideas of surveillance and as you say, correct behavior in society.
And if I could just jump in there with the panopticon, one of the things that is often missed out is that with Foucault, there's an emphasis on that physical oversight that the panopticon offered. But he uses a very interesting phrase. He said, in the panopticon, people, inmates, are computed. They're computed. That means to say they're tracked in a documentary fashion. And if you link that to something as ordinary as the humble library, you can see that, okay, there are these instances of oversight of people's reading and behavior and so on. But basically, libraries are incredibly bureaucratic institutions that keep records about people, not necessarily in a kind of harmful way. So that idea of panopticism as a form of documentary surveillance, administrative surveillance, is often overlooked.
Yeah, I think you're right, and also when we can tie this to things like social media and the internet today as well, where we are all kind of living in this social. It's been called the electronic panopticon, where we have a choice whether we participate in such social media, and yet we don't necessarily know who is watching or observing our shared profiles, our shared information at any particular time. So there's also this idea that, just as Laura was saying in the kind of Foucault idea, where your behavior is regulated by the thought, the threat that you might be being observed, I think there's an argument to be made also that our sort of social media profiles, our social media presence, is regulated by the fact we think other people may be watching, may be observing. So there's a sort of a social element again as well to the way in which the panopticonic idea has sort of filtered through over time. I don't know if Laura would agree with that.
Definitely, and just also reflecting on what Alistair said, I think it's important to also acknowledge that the panoptic idea is also very much linked with exactly bureaucracy. Foucault calls it the net of writing that sort of captures the individual, and then it's easy to see the links to our present and contemporary data variance, or whatever we would call it, where we are sort of defined by our data, and we have our data doubles or our data twins, or whatever we call it, that are sort of created by the data that we sort of feed in voluntarily or less voluntarily. We also can argue for that.
Okay, I'm aware that we need to make time for questions from the audience. So moving on to the next question. We know that the state, and this has come up several times in the conversation this evening, we know that the state has been central to the history of surveillance, but possibly in two major contexts that has been true: in the context of war, and also in the context of the arrangements states make for the welfare of their citizens. To what extent would that be true? I don't know, Toni, if you want to take that first.
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, there's a lot that can be said on this, and I think it links fundamentally to the idea of the social contract, which is something that's been around. The idea of the social contract has been around since sort of Roman and Greek times, really, and in antiquity, but came to particular precedence during the 17th and 19th century, named after the book by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 1760s. It sort of picks up on the idea that individuals are willing to give up certain liberties or freedoms or information about themselves in return for services from the state or protection from the state in terms of threat or such sort of situation. So this idea of a social contract is something that we see particularly manifesting in modern period, in kind of 19th and 20th centuries. The state as a central agent didn't really come to the fore until the First World War and subsequently the Second World War during the 20th century, where there was this massive need for central collections of information on citizens in order for the state to operate a kind of war machine, essentially. And that was the trade-off. The state protected its individuals in return for collection of information for ID cards or in order to facilitate rationing or these kind of things. And subsequently with the welfare state in the post-war period, in order to organise that on a national scale, the state needs to know who it is paying out welfare payments to and where those people are. So there's a tension, there has been historically a tension between how much information, how many rights individuals are willing to secede to the state, to their sort of society, if you like, and against what expectations they have for protection or assistance in times of duress.
And perhaps you could just add on here too that that this massive gathering of information not necessarily is combined with surveillance. If we go into a discussion about what we then see as surveillance, what is surveillance, then you could also discuss what is the intentions behind the gathering of data or information about the citizens. And when we talk about welfare, at least here in a Danish welfare context, I think most of us think that the benefits that we get does not sort of match an idea about surveillance. We have our CPR number that is much more defining for us in Denmark than I think social security numbers are elsewhere. But we do not necessarily conceive of that as surveillance because of the benefits. So that is definitely some kind of, as you said, Toni, a tension between surveillance and welfare, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think the idea of intent is significant. I mean, there's the example of Bismarck, the German Chancellor from the 1880s, who is credited with setting up one of the first sort of national systems of state welfare, and yet actually, he introduced universal male suffrage and these sort of nascent forms of state welfare for the working class, particularly, and yet actually. When you go and look in this in more detail, his reasons behind it, his intent was less because of benevolence towards his, the German citizens, and more to try and to remove the threat of social democracy, which was calling for all these kind of more benevolent measures. So sometimes the intent and the purpose and the consequence are quite blurred. There's quite interesting lines between these things that we can explore as historians as well. I think we can probably add that to the COVID pandemic now as well. We see a lot of tensions between what people are willing to give up in terms of the protections for the state, and there are nascent forms of that as well, from the Black Death in the 14th century, where some infection rates had to be recorded to prevent contamination, or the 19th century cholera outburst, where there were the comments from the Prime Minister, Lord Derby, about how people couldn't be legislated into health because they simply wouldn't obey, or we prefer to take our chances with cholera rather than be bullied into health, I think the Times said in the 1850s. So there's this very strong tension between these ideas.
Yes, if I can just jump in there, I've recently done some work on the history of information policy before the computer, and I was very pleased to be able to bring into that work which had already been done by others, and that was on the subject of what were known as books of orders from the Tudor period, where the Privy Council, the King via the Privy Council, would send out these books of orders on things like the harvest, how well or badly the harvest was going, disease, as you mentioned, Toni, the incidence of the plague, to try and bring that information back to the centre to monitor things, in order to change policy in some way. So that certainly reminded me of that. Okay, can we just move on? So we've spoken about the state and warfare and welfare. What about private organizations and things like big business? These are often overlooked as in the history of surveillance as main players. What would you say to that?
But I would just draw the attention, for instance, to well, perhaps you can't call it a corporation in that respect, but I think also the church has had a great impact on and doing a lot of surveillance, actually, also in history. But much more recently, I would look into also the factories. Michel Foucault discussed also how the panoptic sort of moved into the manufacture. But one of the contributions in this recent, or this book that's coming out, is also trying to explain and look at how surveillance unfolded on the factory floor in a German chocolate factory in the 1920s, and see how surveillance was conducted along sort of the assembly line, surveilling particularly the women, in order to sort of sustain the patriarchal norms of society in general. And in this contribution, actually, which is hugely interesting, you also see how sort of counter surveillance sort of emerges, and people denouncing each other, sort of trying to match the surveillance with some kind of surveillance from beneath, or surveillance, or what you would call it. So definitely we see surveillance within different kind of corporations. I think James B. Roux showed in the 1960s how banks and insurance companies sort of used massive information in order perhaps not to surveil their customers, but at least to get them, monitor them to behave in certain ways, which is definitely a surveillance aspect.
Yeah, I think that's so true, and we can see a lot of those ideas, I think, reflected in modern times now as well, with things like the very recently launched Amazon just walk out stores, I think they're called, where you just walk in, pick your items up, and the technology scans you and you walk out again. The element here is choice as a consumer, as a for big business and commerce. As a citizen of that actively, you're making an active choice when you go into that store. You're making an active choice when you click your preferences on a website or social media or whatever, whether you permit cookies, whether you permit tracking, all of these kind of things. And there's a really interesting argument put by Oz Frankel, who talks about the collection of statistics in the 19th and 20th centuries in the US and the UK and England, where he talks about this massive collection of data for social reform was not just people being participants in that, in terms of the subjects of it rather being the objects of this data being collected about them, but also there was this huge zeal to read these reports and to participate in these kind of discussions and data. So there's this idea very much, I think, about the sort of personal information economy, as it's been called. Suzanne Lace has written about what she calls it the glass consumer, where supermarket loyalty cards that go back to the 1930s. There's a real history of this idea as well in commerce and business, about it being a two-way dynamic. I think is I guess the point I'm trying to make.
So linked to surveillance in these non-state arenas, we've had an interesting question from Maximilian Ward, and the question is, how do you think workplace surveillance of employees has changed over time? Is that something you can field?
Do you want me to take it, Laura?
You can begin, and I can jump in again.
Yeah, I think again this is a really interesting idea, but the idea that people need to be observed in order to sort of do their jobs most efficiently has quite a long history. This kind of Taylorist economics of the sort of turn of the 20th century coming into play here, and we can see particularly the idea of 19th century factory, for example. Prior to industrialization, the daily work routine is very organic. It's restricted to the rising and setting of the sun. But after industrialization, it becomes much more regulated with the clock and artificial light and clocking in and clocking out machines. So the employees are still being watched and regulated, but it's much more overt, I suppose, much more obvious. There's an example of, we think of it as being quite sinister, but there's an architectural furniture example from the mid-1900s, I think it's about 1915. An American company designs a new desk called the efficiency desk. And of course, workers' desks prior to that had been what we imagine to be the kind of Victorian cubbyhole with lots of nooks and crannies. You fold down, you can close it again, you can lock it after you, the kind of bureau. But this efficiency desk that emerged was what's much more recognisably a modern desk, just a flat, clean surface that can be stacked in or laid out in rows. And so it's much more, the employees are much more exposed, this sort of precursor, I guess, to open plan workspace that we might see now. So whereas we might recognise new technologies that track your emails or your toilet breaks or any such thing, these are obviously much more invasive, but it's all relative, because I think we can still see the same purpose there, which was to maximise employee efficiency.
And also to prevent, for instance, this case from the chocolate factory, that they sort of ate the chocolate, for instance, that would not do. So they were also inspected in the bathrooms and dressing and undressing, and I think just some kind of drawing a line to present day and workplace surveillance. I think this stress on efficiency is definitely there, but now it's also sort of combined with this more having a good work flow and having a good work time for the employee, this sort of welfare of the employee, having sensors that sort of indicate when it's too warm or when it's too cold, but it's also registering who is not who is there, but that somebody is there, for instance. So I don't know if that is a difference, but perhaps a continuity is the efficiency that continues.
I think we have time for 2 more questions from the audience. So firstly, Nuala Teague has asked, in your opinion, what would you say is the biggest change in surveillance from the last century, the 20th century, to this century? Any candidates that come to mind?
I hope you would jump in and take that, Toni.
I can. I was thinking that it's a huge question. Obviously, there's so many different changes, but I think the 2 interesting ones for me are the fact that technology has allowed surveillance to become more invasive, and therefore the boundaries between the private sphere, the public sphere, have become very blurred. So that's one. And the second is the changing relationship and attitudes towards citizens, towards us as individuals, to what extent we are willing to accept different surveillance practices. You might be willing to accept everyone seeing what's on your mobile phone, having a big digital footprint, but you may not be willing, for example, to accept other kinds of surveillance on you, or the intent, what's being done with your data. I think people are more aware in many ways than they used to. So those are the big changes I think I would flag up.
And then one thing too, tying into that, is that we also now perhaps see some kind of reservation, a strange reservation, when it's the state that surveils. We are very much more skeptic towards that. Private companies, well, we sort of, if we want to communicate over Facebook, we have to accept that they that we are under surveillance or give away our information. That's a kind of interesting distinction that sometimes occur. But on the other side, we are also very much aware that we cannot live, we cannot Google, we cannot communicate with friends without Facebook. So, but we are still also very skeptic and aware. I think we see this beginning awareness. I agree with that, Toni.
Okay, and I think the last question, which in fact comes from Beth, who's helped on the administrative side of things for this session. Is there something in the history of surveillance that you would change or would have done differently? Is that something you'd like to grab hold of, that question?
Laura, let you take this one.
Is that the one for me? If you refer to the book, I think it will have been much more interesting still to have these stories from people experiencing surveillance. I mean, what does it mean being surveilled? How does that affect your attitude towards states, corporations, whatever? How do you navigate in a world under surveillance? I think that would definitely be something that I would very much like to focus on, but that is also really difficult to get at in a historical perspective. We need people basically to reflect very openly upon it, and that's and because most of them were the poorer people, as Toni mentioned earlier, then it's difficult to get access to their thoughts and experiences.
Yeah, I would just sort of add that the sort of question where you ask a historian, is there anything you would have done differently or would have changed, is this sort of a bit of a misnomer, really, because historians, of course, are always looking at why things happened, what was the impact, cause of events, causality, and so forth. So I think there are lots of things that we could argue potentially, could have been done differently or would have changed the way things have developed. What's more interesting a question perhaps, is what we might do now differently going forward, having learnt from some of the lessons of the past.
Well, that's a very big question, and it's a good question to finish on. I think we've gone over our hour, so can I thank our two conversationalists tonight, and also the backroom team for bringing this event to everyone, and I hope you enjoyed it. Okay, good evening.